I think for a lot of the high-profile people who are named and listed in these documents, it's no surprise. My understanding is former President Clinton didn't even object to the release of these documents. He certainly made his statement saying that he hasn't been associated with Jeffrey Epstein since the early 2000s, had no knowledge of his crimes. So I don't think really any of the names listed are going to affect any of the actual people or their reputations, because it's been so widely known who Jeffrey Epstein associated himself with.
What is it like for the victims of Epstein when the story gets back into the headlines again, Mr. Fudali?
It's really tough, and that's a great question. Of course, there's interest from the victims and there being more exposure and more knowledge of the public of sort of the breadth of the crimes that Jeffrey Epstein perpetrated. But it really is a double-edged sword, because these victims have been suffering at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein, not just from the abuse itself, but from the aftermath and the fear of Mr. Epstein for decades. So just every time his face has to pop up on the TV, they got to see his name on their phones or on anywhere. It really is reopening really deep wounds. And it really runs counter to the closure that they want and need.
Yeah. I mean, it's a plain fact, although a slightly uncomfortable one, that this story is somewhat titillating, that those of us who are not directly impacted by these horrendous allegations find it rather fascinating. And then there's this added celebrity element as well. It's all rather unpleasant, isn't it, really?
It's very unpleasant, and I sort of call it the memeification of this Epstein, saga, and also just sort of this sensationalism around it, where people are looking for the conspiracy. They want something more from this, and I don't think people really understand what a monster and what a predator Jeffrey Epstein was. He's the most prolific predator of our time, and he sexually abused multiple women a day, pretty much for decades. And it's really devastating. And I agree with you that it is sort of very unpleasant how the media and the public have sort of, almost cheered for this exposure surrounding Epstein.
Well, what will happen next?
Well, there may be some more documents revealed. My understanding is there's some appeals and some objections which are still being dealt with. And there may be more documents, but my hope is that this sort of just goes away now and the victims can finally find the peace and the closure that they need.
What about the situation in this country regarding Prince Andrew, who remains, I think it's fair to say, very much on the fringes of the royal family, although there have been indications lately that the King, his brother Charles, is perhaps somewhat more open to him than in the past?
Yeah, I certainly can't speak to that inner workings of the royal family. But yeah, I mean, there's, I don't know there will be more, revelations, more documents released with his name or not. I do understand that his name was at least mentioned, I believe, in some deposition transcript in this last one. But it's certainly difficult for me to say where that will lead with Prince Andrew.
And Bill Clinton, his name appears. What about his reputation?
Same. I think for a lot of the high-profile people who are named and listed in these documents, it's no surprise. My understanding is former President Clinton didn't even object to the release of these documents. He certainly made his statement saying that he hasn't been associated with Jeffrey Epstein since the early 2000s, had no knowledge of his crimes. So I don't think really any of the names listed are going to affect any of the actual people or their reputations, because it's been so widely known who Jeffrey Epstein associated himself with.
Yeah. Sure. But there is just something unsatisfactory about all this, isn't there? Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison. I mean, she may well be released at some point over the next couple of decades. But the women, the victims, go on suffering. And the media is not likely to leave this story alone. And obviously, I'm talking about it on a radio station now. So it's all somewhat dispiriting, isn't it?
It is. It is. The victims lost their chance at, true justice when Jeffrey Epstein, took his own life in jail. There was some measure of justice when Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted, and some of the victims that I have represented, or all the victims I represent at least, were able to get, some measure of civil justice through the claims program in the United States. But yeah, it is very unsettling. It is very unsatisfactory that this continues to perpetuate this sort of Epstein news cycle every now and then. And I think it's time for closure for the victims.